Influencing popular culture, politics, and everything in between. The local station takes you ringside as we discuss the crazy world that is professional wrestling. This is Going Ringside with the local station.
Hello, wrestling fans, and thank you for joining us today for another episode of Going Ringside. Hope you continue to follow the show and spread the word about it. Wherever you get your podcasts, let people know they can check out Going Ringside. And as always, give us a follow at both TikTok and Instagram at Going Ringside. We put constant updates there almost daily, sometimes multiple times a day, about things happening in the wrestling world that you won't see here on the podcast. So I do want to put that out there. And our episode today is a sad one. As you know, it has been a very difficult week in the wrestling world. Two very high-profile deaths, back to back. One unexpected, but not totally unexpected due to age. The other one completely unexpected due to age. Terry Funk and Bray Wyatt. We got the news in the middle of last week that Terry Funk, 79-year-old hardcore legend, had passed away. Terry Funk is a legend in this industry, really originated that hardcore style, and then it was almost seemed like 24 hours later, a much more shocking headline because of his age, we learned that Bray Wyatt has passed away. Bray Wyatt was only 36 years old. So I do want to talk about the two of them today and their contributions to the business. We have a stacked show talking to a lot of people. We are going to have an interview with Bray Wyatt's dad, Mike Rotunda. It was an interview I conducted a few months ago that we've been waiting on because we were planning on doing an episode on Bray Wyatt and the Rotunda family and the Windham family. And then this tragedy happened, and I think these interviews are still appropriate that we had planned for a Bray Wyatt Mike Rotunda episode. So we'll be showing those today. Also, a little later on the show, we are going to be speaking to one of his contemporaries back in the 70s and 80s. That is Terry Funk. That would be Abdullah the Butcher, a guy who wrestled Terry Funk all over the world in that hardcore style. Abdullah was nice enough to join us here on the podcast and talk a little about his memories of Terry Funk. We'll also be talking to DePope Elijah Burke, a friend of the show. He's going to join us. He knew Terry very well, and he's going to offer us some thoughts here later on the show as well. We'll also be hearing from a podcast interview I did with our friends over at the Coming Down the Aisle podcast on the Windham and Rotunda and Bray Wyatt family. It was shot not knowing this would happen, so it's a much happier tone of an interview, but it's still appropriate, and I wanted to show that as well because we didn't know weeks ago when we shot the interview that we would be talking sadly and tragically about the death of Bray Wyatt, so that'll be a little later on in the show as well. So let's start with how we learned. The news came out. I learned on the Terry Funk death from a tweet from Mick Foley, or X rather, a post on X from Mick Foley. He put out the news that Terry Funk had passed. In talking to Abdullah the Butcher a little later on, he said Terry hadn't really heard from him in a while and was worried about him. So, and that does go with age sometime, as you are in your elder years, as Terry was, 79 years old. And then it was almost seemed like 24 hours later. I'd have to look at the timeline, but Triple H puts out the word to everyone, shocking the wrestling world because of Bray Wyatt's age, that Bray Wyatt had passed away unexpectedly. I don't really want to go into the cause of death, particularly on Bray, because I'm sure there will be more to come out, but what's been reported so far is it was COVID-19 related and he had a heart attack, is what's out there. There is some different speculation. I don't want to go into that, but that's what's been reported on the cause of death so far. So first off, when we first heard the news about both Bray Wyatt and Terry Funk, we immediately were on the Going Ringside TikTok channel. I want to show you some of the announcements we put out there as soon as we heard. First Bray Wyatt, followed by Terry Funk. Hey, I'm Scott Johnson, host of the Going Ringside podcast. Breaking and tragic news. Bray Wyatt has unexpectedly passed away. Triple H putting out the news that he got the call from his father, Mike Rotunda, you may remember as IRS. Just shocking the wrestling world. One of the greatest performers of this generation. Bray had been out for a while, and it was this is just really hitting us all very hard. Bray Wyatt, really just a talented, gifted performer, coming up with the Wyatt clan really when he first started to make a mark around 2014, and then doing all his just amazing and memorable gimmicks. A star, an icon, gone too soon. Just a tragedy for the Rotunda and Windham family. He's part of that great wrestling family and heritage. This is hitting the wrestling world hard. We lost Terry Funk yesterday, but Bray Wyatt, much, much younger, a younger generation. A sad tragedy just hitting us really like a ton of bricks just moments ago, this news coming out. Hey, I'm Scott Johnson, host of the Going Ringside podcast. Tragic news. Terry Funk has passed away. The legend was just shy of 80 years old, and Mick Foley put out the news as well as others. It's starting to break right now. Terry Funk was a legend. The Funk family, legendary. What he did in the 1970s and 1980s with respect to being more of a hardcore, crazy Texan was really unparalleled. Going on to have great, memorable feuds with Mick Foley, with Abdullah the Butcher, with guys all through the Mid-South territory, and then eventually getting called up to WWF, ECW. They would call him middle-aged and crazy, as he would call himself all those years. Terry Funk was a memorable legend that cannot be overstated. What an impact he had on this industry. He came up in Texas with the legendary Funk family, with Dory Funk and all the Funks that were in WWF with him, and then he just did so much all those years. So a legend is gone. It is a sad day in the wrestling world. R.I.P. Terry Funk. So that's what we put on TikTok for both Bray Wyatt and Terry Funk's death. This was it was a difficult time for wrestling because both deaths, and all deaths are something to be honored and mourned, but these are both very high-profile deaths in a span of about 48 hours of one another. So the wrestling world was jarred not once, but twice, because Terry Funk is a legend, was a legend in this industry for decades. Bray Wyatt was at the top of his game, was one of the current top stars in the company. Now, while he had been dealing with some health issues, he was still at the top. He was still a peak guy in WWE and had been for several years, for around 10 years. So both ones were major headlines in the wrestling world. So WWE had to scramble and figure out what they were going to do. So SmackDown Friday, right after the news comes out, ditches the show, really, and really made it a memorial to both Bray Wyatt and Terry Funk. Here's a quick clip of how SmackDown opened up Friday night.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This past week, we lost two beloved members of our WWE family. Hall of Famer Terry Funk and the one and only Bray Wyatt.
So Michael Cole really setting off a somber tone for that episode of SmackDown as the wrestling world is in shock, both for Terry, of course, but particularly for Bray because he was so young. Only 36 years old. Let's talk a little about who Bray Wyatt was. Real name, Windham Lawrence Rotunda. Rotunda, named after his dad, Mike Rotunda. Windham, the last name of his uncle, the legendary Bray Windham, both alive and well with us. And we're going to be talking to Mike Rotunda here shortly. he started his wrestling career in WWE, you know, kind of in the developmental territories. He was from Florida, so he was able to do some of the training down in Florida. But he really became nationally known when he started on the old version of NXT. This was around 2010 to 2012. He came in as a guy named Husky Harris. He was a thicker guy, bigger guy, and he did start to, after time in NXT, was eventually brought into the Nexus. You might remember the Nexus. It was that real kind of overpowered group faction of rookies that were taking on guys like Triple H and John Cena, and he was part of them. He was Husky Harris. He was obviously a third-generation wrestler. We knew his dad was Mike Rotunda. We knew his grandfather was Blackjack Mulligan, part of the original Blackjacks. So he had a lineage, so we knew something was going to happen with him. We weren't sure what. But he did his stint in, you know, NXT and then with the Nexus. But we didn't hear from him for a while. Husky Harris was kind of off TV. And then things changed when he's repackaged and comes back as the leader of the Wyatt family. A really amazing gimmick and faction. Really just took eyeballs on the product because they were so good. He had that creepy kind of almost horror film mixed with Charles Manson type theme to him. They immediately get into a major feud with John Cena. He headlines a WrestleMania against John Cena. And just did some really good work. And I'm going to ask Mike Rotunda's dad about that in a little bit. And he was off. I mean, he was a major player in the company, holding multiple world titles. He does a lot with the Bray Wyatt gimmick, and then eventually, after the Wyatt family, for several years, he teams up with Matt Hardy for a while. They're the leaders of worlds, and then eventually transforms into the Fiend, as you know, until pretty recently when Bray really started to come back and have some sporadic appearances over the past year. Bray Wyatt was a man ahead of his time, a really iconic performer, very memorable gimmicks with the Bray Wyatt and the Fiend. There's been a lot of talk right now about if he should be in the Hall of Fame. I don't think there's going to be much arm twisting to make that happen. Bray Wyatt was a tremendous performer, very cerebral and gifted with some of those moves you would do, and you would like that backward back crab or whatever you call it, looked like a spider. He could do some really cool stuff out there. You know, he grew up in the wrestling world. He knew the psychology of the wrestling world. He knew how to wrestle. He was just good at it. So a couple months ago, I was at an event in Florida, and I ran into Mike Rotunda, his father. His father was, you know, did a lot in the wrestling world. He was a part of the Varsity Club in WCW with Kevin Sullivan and Rick Steiner. And then most famously really became IRS. That was his gimmick that he's most known for. And he was part of the Money's Inc. with $1 Million Man and just had that good heel IRS gimmick. Eventually went to WCW as I think Michael Wall Street was his name, kind of keeping that gimmick, was part of the early NWO. I asked him about that. So the interview was not all about Bray. I didn't know that this was going to happen. But I did want to share this interview with Mike Rotunda. And in the end, we talk about Bray and Mike's other son, Bo Dallas, Bray Wyatt's brother. And we'll have to see what happens with Bo Dallas going forward in WWE now that his brother is gone. That'll just be something we're going to have to kind of watch and wait. But I wanted to share this interview with Mike Rotunda that we had been planning to do an entire episode about him and his family. Tragically, I didn't know it would be under these circumstances, but sadly it is. So I do want to share this interview that we did with Mike Rotunda, Bray Wyatt's real-life father, about his life, his career, and then, of course, his children, Bray Wyatt and Bo Dallas. And here's our interview with Bray Wyatt's father, Mike Rotunda. We are excited to be joined now by Mike Rotunda, a.k.a. IRS. back in the day. How are you doing, sir? And I think we have a Jake Roberts.
I'm doing good.
Jake Roberts is here.
Jake's a clown.
Jake is a clown. How have you been?
I'm good.
Talk to me about life for you now. You a lot on the independent circuit, like going to events like these?
Yeah,
like
I do quite a few, maybe 1 or 2 a month, something like that. Nothing really every weekend type of deal, but I just did one over in Europe a couple months ago. I went on Jericho's cruise, so, you know, I keep busy with it. I'm retired. I was producing for WWE for 13 years, so this is a big step down from the travel that I was doing.
Now, if our fans don't know, your sons are Bray Wyatt and Bo Dallas,
yes.
Both extremely overperformers. You proud of your boys? They've done considerably well.
Yeah, they're both hard workers, and, you know, they picked up on the business pretty quickly, and they've done well, so yeah, I'm proud of them.
You did a lot. You did Varsity Club, you were in the NWO, but the thing people remember you for is that dastardly tax man.
Well, that's because nobody likes to pay taxes, that's for sure. So everybody remembers the tax guy.
So when you became IRS, how did that come about?
It's basically, I had started doing a deal in WCW Michael Wall Street, you know, which was kind of a money deal. Yeah. And I didn't renew my contract, so when I went back to work for WWE, they basically presented that to me, and, you know, just kind of figured out how to make it work. And then they put Ted DiBiase and myself together, the $1 Million Man, and, you know, we just clicked together, the crooked rich guy and the crooked tax guy. So it was a good heel persona, and it worked well.
Now, before that, you had a lot of success with Rick Steiner and Kevin Sullivan in Varsity Club.
Yeah.
That was a very over tag team.
Yeah, you know, that worked well too. It was different, and we had the Devil as our coach, Kevin Sullivan, so that was kind of a oddball situation. But yeah, that worked well too, because everybody relates to their area with schools and stuff, and basically you cut interviews, and Steiner went to Michigan, I went to Syracuse, and we talked crap about any school in the area, you know, for that city or town, so people didn't like that either.
Any fun Rick Steiner stories?
Oh yeah, probably none that I should tell on television though, so. But yeah, I had a lot of fun over the years, you know, just with tag team partners with Barry Windham, who's my brother-in-law.
Because you started as the U.S. Express,
right.
Is that right?
Yeah, Dusty Rhodes put Barry and I together, and his sister came to visit, and we were married 6 months later, 40 years ago, so, you know.
Now, when you were Money Inc., I think you went against Natural Disasters, you went against Legion of Doom. Any memories there?
Yeah, I mean, we took on all comers, you know. Ted and I had the tag team titles for a lengthy period, so, you know, we just kept trying to keep going and face whoever they match us up against. So
now, then you go to the NWO.
Right.
You were one of the kind of the stand behind Hogan guys, it almost seemed like.
Yeah, it was, but what happened there, they sent me on a tour to Japan, who New Japan was using the NWO logo. So I ended up going, working for WCW, but I did 20 weeks a year for New Japan, so it worked out well for me, because that whole group over there with Chono and Muda was really over as far as NWO was concerned, and they were doing probably the best business that company ever had at that time. So it was a good opportunity. And basically, I worked 20 weeks a year, and I got my contract from WCW. So,
when did you retire?
Oh, well, I'm 65. 20 years ago.
20 years
45.
ago. So, did you start backstage at WWE? When was that?
I wasn't there immediately after retiring. There was a 3-year period where I did some other stuff, and then I went back after that.
So what were some memories you have of working backstage there?
Oh yeah, it's a hard job. You know, you're in charge of large groups. You go overseas. I did a lot with Arn Anderson, who's over here. You know, just producing. We did all the televisions, ran the live events all over the world. So
who were the top stars when you were running things? You did
probably at that time Cena and Batista.
What was the Cena and Batista run like?
Well, they were on actually 2 different groups. Batista was on SmackDown, Cena was on Raw. So we were doing great business. So it was.
Who did you deal with the most, Cena or Batista?
It varied because you did both brands, you know. So.
What was it like for you when you saw your son main eventing with John Cena?
Yeah, it was great, you know. I wish he would have won, but, you know, so still not done. So that both of my boys are back up there, and we'll be back soon, hopefully.
Now, Bray Wyatt, the gimmick, did you know that was going to come, or how did that come about?
No, he kind of figured that out on his own, you know, and he had the gift of gab and, you know, could pull the character off. So, you know, I got a lot of attention and did well.
Did you teach him and his brother to wrestle early?
Well, somewhat, you know, but they basically went into the WWE developmental school, and that's, you know, I obviously gave them pointers and stuff, but never physically, because I was already working for, you know, on the road all the time. So they picked it up, though. They were both good football players and wrestlers in high school. And Bray went to a junior college in California, and then Troy, Alabama picked him up there, so he went back and played ball there and then got into the wrestling.
And lastly, how you doing physically? Wrestling, I know, takes its tolls on
Yeah,
guys.
You know, I've had one hip replaced. I need another one, but other than that, knock on wood, I'm still getting around.
Well, Mike Rotunda, it has been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
We'll look for you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.
So once again, that was an interview taped a few months ago with Mike Rotunda. We were planning on doing a whole episode about them, but we did not expect it to be under these circumstances. That why it maybe feels a little dated, and we didn't ask as much about his son because we didn't know this was going to happen. But we did talk a little about him, and he thought he should have beat John Cena, which I think is interesting. And did at the time think, you know, his son was going to be coming back. This was unexpected. One other interview that I had been saving for this episode, which will seem a little dated, but I think it's still appropriate, is an interview I did with our friends over at the Coming Down the Aisle podcast. We were talking, and I said, let's talk a little about Mike Rotunda and the Windham family, and Bray Wyatt and Bo Dallas and Blackjack Mulligan, the grandfather. You know, part of the original Blackjacks, what this family was, specifically with Mike Rotunda, and just how they are really one of the great wrestling families that's really maybe doesn't get the appreciation they deserve, because there's so much focus on the Rhodes, the Anawa'es, who we recently discussed on the previous episode, and the Harts, the Von Erichs, but the Rotunda-Windham clan, they really have some talent there. They are one of the greatest. So here's our interview. It's kind of dated, but it's still appropriate on the Rotunda and the Windham family with our friends from the Coming Down the Aisle podcast. Well, we are joined now by John Swallow with the Coming Down the Aisle podcast. John, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Tell us real quickly where people can find the show.
Coming Down the Aisle pod.com, where you can find everything Coming Down the Aisle related. We drop podcasts every Friday.
Well, today we're talking about Mike Rotunda and his lineage, specifically Bo Dallas and Bray Wyatt. Let's start with Dad. You know, I always thought the IRS gimmick seemed stupid, but it really worked and people hated him.
I loved it. Even as a kid, you know, it would get under my skin. But nowadays, looking back on it, during that era, that was just such a fun era to me. The what they call the new generation era. Full of a lot of characters. You know, it was so fun because you had also with my grandfather being a CPA and working for the government at one point, I looked at that like, hey, that's kind of cool.
So I remember him and DiBiase as Money Inc. And I always thought they should lose, because I think they were going against like the Road Warriors and
I know, and
Typhoon and Earthquake as the natural disasters. But they still kept winning.
Yeah, they generated enough heat where they bothered people enough, of course. Even going up against Hogan and Brutus at WrestleMania 9, and they snuck away a victory there, you know.
I forgot about that. I forgot they had that match. That seemed really odd to me.
Yeah, it was Hogan's first time on the card, but not in the main event of WrestleMania.
That was the one with the screw job with Yokozuna and Bret Hart, right?
Right.
But he wasn't billed as in the main event. That was really strange.
Yes. But man, he was so, he would get on the mic and, and just, say, you tax cheats don't deserve blanks, whatever, insert city name, don't deserve, whatever your city's giving you. And he was really fun. I don't know how he wrestled in that gear. Suspenders.
It was the least comfortable wrestling gear ever. So a little earlier in the show, our viewers heard Mike tell me that about his NWO run. And I asked him, were you just a secondary guy? He said, not exactly. They moved him to Japan to do a lot of the NWO in Japan when guys like, I think, Muda and Masahiro Chono or whoever it was doing that Japanese version of the NWO. I didn't really know that he was doing a lot of Japanese work for WCW at the time.
That's interesting, and I guess, during that time, especially in the 90s, New Japan and really needed somebody like a Michael Wall Street or IRS to really help continue their foundation, because things were on the tail end, downslide for New Japan during that time. But
so Rotunda eventually retires. But then his kids start taking off. Bo Dallas, particularly Bray Wyatt. Are you surprised how well his kids have done?
Not. I guess surprised at how good. And considering Mike was in the kind of mid card realm for a while. Yeah. But Bray Wyatt, being a former WWE champion, of course, former Universal champion, and for a while was, big merch getter for WWE, especially with the Fiend gimmick that he had.
The Fiend, the original Wyatt clan. I mean, he was main top of the card stuff.
Right. So yes and no. I mean, wrestling is built into that family because their uncle is also Barry Windham.
Yeah.
And going back even further, Blackjack Mulligan is their grandfather. So, it's in their blood, and definitely third generation, fourth generation, second generation, whatever that may be.
That's a good point. So you bring up, I mean, when we think of top wrestling families, we think of the Anoa'i family, the Harts, the Rhodes, but the Rotunda family and the Windhams, they've done a lot too.
Right. I mean, when Barry Windham is recognized by WWE as a Four Horseman. He went in with the Four Horsemen, even though there was a lot of other individuals a part of Four Horsemen.
Yeah.
So he's recognized as the Fourth Horseman, I guess, if you want to say that. And so, yeah, I mean, they've done a lot.
You think they're a top 5 wrestling family?
Ooh, top 5.
You got some tough ones there. I mean, like, if you had asked me 15 years ago, I would have said, no way. They're not the Von Erichs. They're not the Harts. But specifically what Bray Wyatt has done, I think kind of almost puts them there.
It could, but definitely in the conversation for sure. Never really think about that. But yeah, I mean, you have, of course, the Harts, Anoa'i family. You have
Von Erichs.
McMahon. You could say McMahon family too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you could argue it's either McMahon or Anoa'i. What's the biggest family?
Right.
I mean, McMahon's are their own thing, but the Von Erichs.
Von Erichs for sure. I mean, there's a movie, The Iron Claw, coming out a couple months from now.
Sure.
I mean, they were huge in Texas. And I'm from Louisiana, so I hear even like my dad's generation talking about Von Erichs. Just how impactful they were. So, They definitely could be in the conversation.
I'm going to start putting this on wrestling websites. Like, they're not getting their just due.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. That's something I didn't stop and think about.
I didn't think about it till we had this very episode. I was like, these guys have done a lot. I mean, Blackjack Mulligan was huge.
Big time. I mean, the Blackjacks could be an all-time tag team for sure. So,
sure.
Yeah.
100%. Well, John Swallow with the Coming Down the Aisle podcast. Thanks for joining us again on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott.
So that was our interview, and I just really thought it was interesting. We didn't really think about it till mid-interview that we thought, this is really one of the great wrestling families out there. With, you know, I don't know that it was there when it was just Barry Windham, Blackjack, and Mike Rotunda. They were a good wrestling family. I don't know if they were one of the greats, but what Bray Wyatt did as Bray Wyatt and The Fiend, taking his heritage of name, Windham Rotunda in real life, they did a lot. His family is a 3-generation wrestling family. Top of the card here and there. I mean, IRS was a tag team champion, a high-profile tag team champion. Barry Windham, part of the Four Horsemen. The Blackjacks, a legendary tag team. And then Bray Wyatt and Bo Dallas doing great work here in the modern generation. So a great family. They've contributed a lot to the wrestling world, and it is a very tragic loss, the loss of Bray Wyatt. The other loss that we've talked about, and I want to get to now, is the loss of Terry Funk. Terry Funk is a guy who came up with his family, the legendary Funk family with Dory Funk, and wrestled all over the world. He did that hardcore Texan gimmick before hardcore was hardcore. Before there was an ECW, there was Terry Funk. I mean, he was doing that crazy Texan gimmick in WWF and around the world, all over the place. One of the guys he would go up and down the roads with, wrestle all in various countries with, who was really one of those other originators of the hardcore style, blood and just crazy stuff, was Abdullah the Butcher. I contacted Abdullah after we heard the sad news of Terry Funk's passing, because they had been close for many years. And Abdullah said he had been trying to get in touch with Terry and kind of lost contact. He wasn't sure what was going on, and I had to break the news to him of what had happened. So tragically, Terry Funk did pass away. And I was able to catch up with Abdullah the Butcher. Now, there was some audio issues here, so I had to kind of repeat myself a few times to Abdullah, but he still was very good for us, and we're happy to talk to him. But this is our interview with Abdullah the Butcher on the loss of his dear friend, Terry Funk. Well, we're joined right now by Abdullah the Butcher, the legendary Abdullah the Butcher. Abdullah, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.
Abdullah, this is hard news for everyone. The loss of Terry Funk, your longtime friend.
You know, I was in my room sleeping, and Mrs. Malika come in there. She come running. She says, "I got bad news." I said, "Oh, not it." So when she told me about Terry Funk, I couldn't take it. I couldn't take it. I couldn't take it because Terry. I've been trying to get with him, talk to him. I used to talk to him, and all of a sudden, it was just cut off. I was not talking to him no more. And I kept asking people, "Where is Terry Funk? Where is he at?" You know, then they started saying he's in a home, he's in this and stuff like that. But my thing is, maybe he didn't want me to hear him this way, you know, talking, you know, like he had a problem. See?
Tell me about your relationship with Terry Funk all these years.
Terry Funk, at first, let me tell you a little story first about Terry Funk. Terry Funk had these alligator boots, right? Alligator. And I said, "Oh, Terry, I would like to have a pair of those alligator boots." And I kept bugging him all the time, bugging him for the cowboy boots. He said, "Abdullah, I'm going to get you a pair." So it must have took him about maybe a couple of months or whatever. All of a sudden, he come in the dressing room with a box. He said, "Abdullah, here's your cowboy boots." And I said, "Oh, Terry, thank you. You got me some nice alligator boots. Thank you, right?" So I was going into the other room. He said, No. Stay here. I want you to open them up here. I said, "No, Terry. This is between me and you." He said, "Abdullah, please, open them up here." I said, "No." So I walked into the other dressing room, and I opened them up. There were some boots. They were so old, and they had shit all over them. You know, shit on the boots, right? But Terry's thing was to get me in front of all the boys, and when I, you know, opened up the box, and Terry would have probably said, show them to the boys, show them to the boys, show the boys the boots. You know, and that's where I got him.
What does the wrestling world lose with the loss of Terry Funk? What did he mean to the wrestling world?
Terry Funk was a legend, over a legend. Terry Funk could come up with different ideals. He was a professional. And Terry Funk, I fought him many times, so many times, I started looking like him. You understand? But the main part about it was this here. One time, Terry got up there, and he was he went to New York. And when he went to New York, he was wrestling like in New York. And Terry said, Abdullah, I got to try to steal the show. And whatever Terry Funk done, he stole the show. But in my opinion, Terry Funk was a legend, over a legend, and I always respected him. I fought him so many times in Japan. I fought him all over. And to me, I always respected Terry. He was a legend.
Was he one of the real hardcore guys that you fought? Because you did so much hardcore.
Yes, so much. Terry Funk, his arm would bleed. His leg would bleed. Anytime I stabbed him, if I stabbed him in the chest, I stabbed him here, he was bleeding there.
So you would really stab him?
Huh?
You would really stab him?
No. But Terry would always say, get my leg. I'd get his leg. Blood. Arm. Blood. But not all at the same time.
Okay.
You know, something different. You know what I mean? Like his arm, or I would get his hand. I'd stab the hand would be bleeding. I'd get the air would be bleeding. I'd get the head would be bleeding. He was a professional. He was a professional.
Was he would always say he was middle-aged and crazy. Was that true?
Pardon?
He would always say he was middle-aged and crazy. Was that true?
Terry was a professional. You know what I mean? He'd done a lot of things. He can be crazy. He can be civilized. He can be anything what he wanted to be to get the people. He was a professional.
Was he a tough guy? Was he real tough in real life?
Oh, real life, he was tough. Yeah, he could take care of himself. And when he had the championship belt, he was. I think he drew more money than any of the champions.
In which territory was that in?
I think it was all over. He went into any place he went. He had the world's belt. Yep.
Any matches that come to mind when you think of Terry? Any specific matches?
Pardon?
Any specific matches that come to mind when you think of Terry Funk?
Every time I wrestled Terry Funk, it was an honor to wrestle Terry Funk because I knew we were going to have a hell of a match. And Terry Funk would put his heart into it. Any match what he had with me or I had with him, we'd go there and tear the house down. Because the first thing we'd say, we got to make sure that nobody follows this. And that's where we were.
Where were some of the places you and Terry Funk fought? Was it in the U.S. or would you fight in different countries?
I fought with Funk in Tokyo for about at least 30, 40 years.
Really?
Yes, well, at least 40 years because I've been going to Japan for about 50. And Terry Funk and Dory was always in Japan. And that was it. And,
why did you and Terry Funk, of all the guys of your generation, seem to be the most hardcore? What was it about you and Terry that made you so hardcore?
We made it that way. You gotta have the people to believe. And that's what Terry could do, and that's what I could do. You understand? That was it. The key is in the wrestling business, you got to know how to sell. You never seen Terry Funk taking bumps and, flying all over, but you seen him screaming and hollering, like when somebody was stabbing him or something like that. That's it. See,
What was he like out of the ring? What was he like in real life?
Out of the real life, to me, he was a gentleman. I would never knock Terry. Terry was a beautiful person. He put his heart into everything what he done, and that's it.
Did you guys work together in Mid-South or WCW? Where all did you work in the U.S.?
I can't say. We worked all over. That's all we done was worked all over. We worked in I think Calgary. We worked all over.
When people think the greatest of all time, they think of Hogan and Flair. Do you think Terry Funk is in the conversation of the greatest of all time?
Pardon?
Do you think Terry Funk should be considered one of the greatest of all time, like
Terry
Flair and
Funk
Hogan?
will always be one of the greatest. When Terry Funk's gone, but people will still remember him. When anytime that there's an arena or a building or whatever, and they have a wrestling match, Terry Funk will be there. He's gone, but he will be there. People will always remember Terry Funk.
What was he like? Did he love his family? Was he close with his family? Because the Funks were so important to wrestling.
Well, in my opinion, I don't know too much about his family, but I knew about him and his brother Dory. I knew about them. And they were good.
Anyone else close with Terry? I know he was pretty close with Mick Foley, Cactus Jack.
Yes. Mick Foley, Cactus Jack, yes. Real close.
Had you been worried about Terry since you lost touch with him?
I've always worried about Terry Funk. Always worried about Terry Funk.
Why?
Because he was a gentleman, that's number one. Number two, anytime that we got together, we done business. To me, Terry Funk is a gentleman. He's a legend. He's everything what people try to be. Plus,
what could young wrestlers learn from Terry Funk?
Pardon?
What could young wrestlers learn from Terry Funk?
Watch his tapes. They should watch Terry Funk's tapes and learn how to work from Terry Funk. All what he done, every match Terry Funk had, you understand, was a great match. Every match. He could make anybody.
Do you think he had a good, who else did he have a good relationship with? Who else would you guys kind of work in the same territories with?
Well, I used to work with his tag team with his brother, the Dory Funk in Japan many times. We had tag team matches with the Sheik, the Rural Sheik from Detroit and Puerto Rico and stuff like that. Every place like that.
Well, Abdullah the Butcher, thank you so much for joining us to talk about your friend Terry Funk. Thanks for joining us today.
I want to say this, please.
Yes, go ahead.
I want all the people to never forget Terry Funk, that he was a great wrestler. He was a professional. And I'm really sorry that he's gone. Believe me when I tell you that. I really respected him. And when Mrs. Malika came and told me what happened, I said, no. I started hollering, no. Because I really cared for Terry Funk. And I respected him until the day that I die. Always respect him. That's it.
Abdullah, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate you speaking with us today.
Thank you, sir, for having me on your station. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, just Abdullah at the end there tearing up. Just a sad state of affairs to lose Terry Funk, just a legend there. I mean, very close with Mick Foley, obviously, very close with Abdullah. I mean, he did time in the ECW. He was even in the Attitude Era when he would call himself middle-aged and crazy. And he was really good. He was just a legendary, one of those generational performers, Terry Funk was. As Abdullah would say, just a true professional. He knew how to make things look real, how to make things look crazy, all over the world with Abdullah. Another guy who knew him was our friend of the show, Elijah Burke, longtime performer in the wrestling world with TNA as the Pope, and then he did time in the ECW brand of WWE and with WWE as Elijah Burke under his own name. And we invited him on to talk a little about Terry Funk and his memories of Terry. And here's our interview with Elijah Burke. Well, we are joined right now by Elijah Burke, a.k.a. the Pope, to talk about Terry Funk, the legend. Elijah, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
Talk to me about Terry Funk and kind of what he meant to the wrestling world and your interactions with Terry over the years.
Well, I think it goes without saying that Terry was an absolute classy, believable performer that gave something to the world of professional wrestling like probably no one before his time. Terry Funk, literally every time you saw him, you believed him. I think that's one of the main things. My friend Cody called him a cowboy. Like Dusty. These guys, they paved the way for individuals like me and so many others. And it's just heartbreaking that we're even sitting here talking about it, but so shall it be someday with you and I. But when it comes to Terry, man, Terry was probably one of the last true cowboys that did things his way by his own merits. One time I was at the Jacksonville Coliseum, and I was privy enough to be backstage. We've talked. I've told you how my sister was a sergeant, so I kind of used her name. They let me backstage to wait, even though she wasn't there. And it was for a WCW show. Flair was supposed to face Sting, but Flair did not make the trip for whatever reason, and Terry Funk took his place. Terry Funk went to the ring with Sensational Sherry. Sensational Sherry, Martel Resurso, she was the catalyst of Terry Funk losing that show in Jacksonville at the Coliseum here. So when that was over with, I'm backstage, and all of a sudden, this is after the show, all of a sudden, Sherry comes running out of the dressing room. He's crazy. And right after she exits the door of the dressing room, a chair flies behind her. A folding chair.
Wow.
That Terry Funk has grabbed out of the dressing room and threw it. So again, reality, entertainment, who knows? But everybody backstage left saying that Terry Funk is really wacko, and that's what the fans love about him. That's what the wrestlers like myself who have come into contact, had the chance to meet him, had the chance to be on shows and conventions with Terry Funk. He is just the complete opposite, though. When the camera's not rolling, he's the complete opposite when he meets fans or he meets an aspiring wrestler in the business.
I just talked also we had on the show Abdullah the Butcher, a guy who wrestled all over the world with him. He said Terry was he was a professional everywhere he went. Would you say that's accurate?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you talk about being a professional and Terry Funk, well, that goes hand in hand. Look at the many times that Terry Funk, the legend of former NWA champion, has came and gone. You cannot be a professional in this industry and go and come as many times as Terry Funk has, unless you are a true professional. He wasn't just a true professional, but he was a well-respected true professional. And that's Terry.
Want to get your opinion on Bray Wyatt. This has been a hard week for the wrestling world to lose someone so young, such a tremendous performer.
Yeah, it's crazy, Scott. I was getting prepared for my podcast, Pope's Point of View, with Elijah Burke, and me and my co-host Polo Del Mar, just right before we go on, and we're preparing to talk about Terry. We recorded that very day, Thursday, which is our recording time, and to say that was a hard one. You know, I have a saying that I always use on the podcast that at some point, Scott, we all have to do the job for the Grim Reaper. And for those who don't know what that means that the 1, 2, 3 in the wrestling business means doing the job. And so we all have to do that. But for him to be so young and for it to be so unexpected, you know, that's the tragedy. That's the tragedy of it. I've come across Bray. Bray really blossomed after my time with the WWE. But every time I've crossed paths with Bray, it's been nothing but pleasant, you know.
And he had a lot of start down here in Florida. Florida is a great territory for young wrestlers to start. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know the history going all the way back to Florida Championship Wrestling. That goes without saying. And then they got that back up started with the WWE, which is where Bray Wyatt was down in Tampa, you know, getting his start before FCW's transition over to become the Performance Center, aka NXT. And when to talk about Bray, you got to talk about his creative genius. You know, that whole Bray Wyatt character, that was Bray's idea. That whole theme, that was Bray's idea. That wasn't the company. That wasn't creative. That was Bray saying, "Here's what I want to do, and trust me to do it." And they did. And the magic and the aura that he created surrounding all of his characters was just today second to none. And I don't think and listen, not since The Undertaker did we have such a character. And I don't think we'll ever get a character like that again.
Well, Elijah Burke, thanks so much for joining us on the show today. I appreciate it.
No worries, man. Thank you, Scott.
So I wish we had a happier episode, but we didn't. This has certainly been a downer of an episode, losing two iconic names in the wrestling world with both Terry Funk and then almost within 48 hours, the young man, Bray Wyatt. The WWE Universe will not be the same without them. Bray was obviously an iconic performer in the modern era. People are expecting him to maybe be back. Many are pushing for him to go into the Hall of Fame. I wouldn't be surprised if you see him there soon. And of course, what happens with his brother, Bo Dallas? Does he still get a push? There's been a lot of talk of what happens with the Uncle Howdy character. Where does that go? Because there were still some, leftover storylines from Bray. WWE will have to figure out how they want to handle that. And of course, Terry Funk, just a legendary performer all over the globe. This is hitting people like Mick Foley and Abdullah the Butcher and so many others hard. But just two legendary losses in the wrestling world in the span of a week. It's been a sad week for the wrestling universe, but we're appreciative of you joining us to memorialize these two great guys who really entertained the fans for so many years. So thanks for joining us on this episode of Going Ringside. We'll see you back here next time.
This has been Going Ringside with The Local Station, brought to you every Wednesday on your favorite podcast player, on News4 Jax Plus, as well as the News4 Jax YouTube channel.